Colonel Briggs strode across the polished concrete of Fort Ralston with the kind of authority only years of rank and unchecked ego could buy. The morning sun glinted off the rows of tanks and Humvees parked in military precision, casting long shadows across the training grounds. Every soldier he passed instinctively straightened, their movements stiff and tense, though the expression on his face told them he wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for a reaction. Fear, embarrassment, anything that reminded him that he was the king of this small, rigid world. The base had been buzzing with an unusual sense of anticipation all morning. A helicopter was scheduled to arrive, carrying a civilian oversight liaison from the Pentagon. Nobody knew much about her, except that her arrival had been arranged at the last minute and that she would be reviewing leadership protocols across the command. That meant only one thing to Briggs. Someone with an unfamiliar authority was coming to poke around in his domain, and he didn't take kindly to outsiders questioning his methods. Briggs scoffed as he overheard two lieutenants whispering about the visitor. Probably some clipboard-hugging intern who couldn't tell an M16 from a broomstick, he said under his breath, shaking his head. His pride would not allow him to imagine otherwise. After all, he had commanded Fort Ralston for nearly 8 years, and in that time he had cultivated an iron grip over every soldier, every officer, and every mundane detail of base life. Who was this civilian, and why did she think she could waltz in and scrutinize him? The helicopter landed with a low, grinding thud, kicking up a storm of dust and sand. Briggs watched from the command platform, his arms crossed and a smirk curling at the edge of his lips. Out stepped a woman dressed in unassuming black slacks and a fitted jacket, her posture perfectly straight, her gait unhurried, and her sunglasses reflecting the morning sun like dark shields. There was no flurry of assistants, no entourage, just her, alone, moving with a quiet authority that seemed to unsettle even the seasoned staff around her. Briggs pushed off from the railing and marched toward her, the sound of his polished boots clicking sharply on the concrete. Soldiers turned their heads to watch the inevitable confrontation. "You lost, ma'am," he barked, voice loud enough to echo across the courtyard. "Civilian tour don't start until Friday." She looked up at him, her gaze calm but deliberate, measuring him as one might assess a malfunctioning weapon before deciding whether to fix it or discard it. "No, Colonel. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said, her voice steady, cool, and unyielding. Briggs's eyebrows shot up. The audacity. She didn't flinch, didn't bend, didn't even acknowledge his rank in the tone of her voice. He tried to gauge her reaction, trying to read a hint of fear or hesitation, but there was none. The woman's composure was unshakable, and it irritated him more than anything else could. "I see," he said, forcing a smirk. "Well, we'll see about that." There was a faint edge of challenge in his voice, one that he had deployed countless times over the years, always with predictable results. Never before had anyone matched it with silence and calm that suggested not just confidence but control. She gave him a small, polite smile, a smile that was neither friendly nor mocking, just knowing. "We will," she replied. The words were ordinary, but there was a weight to them, a quiet authority that made the hairs on the back of Briggs's neck prick. He cleared his throat and motioned to the sergeant escorting her. "Carry on, then." As the woman followed the sergeant down the hallways of the base, Briggs shadowed them, scrutinizing every move. He leaned toward his aide-de-camp and muttered, "Something about her, I don't trust it. Look at the way she carries herself, like she owns the place already." "Sir," the aide said carefully, "we've been instructed to give her full cooperation." Briggs waved a dismissive hand. "Cooperation is fine, but respect, that's earned, and I intend to test her, see how she handles a real military environment." That afternoon, Briggs arranged a meeting in the briefing room. It was a simple room, sterile and functional, with long tables and a projector screen. A handful of officers were present, most looking anxious and uncomfortable. They knew Briggs's reputation, and now they were about to witness a clash that none of them would forget. Briggs leaned across the table, voice low but venomous. "So, you're here to observe. Fine, but let me be clear, this isn't a sandbox. We deal with lives here, not theories." The woman didn't respond immediately. She pulled out a notebook, pen poised, and wrote something down. Slowly she looked up, her eyes meeting his through the dim lighting of the briefing room. "Fascinating," she murmured. "Your leadership style is outdated." Briggs froze for just a fraction of a second. The words were soft, almost casual, but the implication struck deeper than any command he had ever issued. His smirk faltered. "Outdated? You're new here, you haven't seen anything." Her eyes, steady and precise, held his gaze. "I see enough," she said simply. Briggs scoffed and tried a different tactic, sarcasm. "Let me guess, you work in HR, public relations, maybe environmental compliance." He allowed a small laugh, expecting the room to share it. Instead, he noticed the subtle tightening of the sergeant's jaw, the slight shift in posture among the lieutenants. His usual theatrics weren't landing as they normally did. The woman's silence stretched. She wasn't intimidated, amused, or flustered. She was assessing him, weighing him, measuring every reaction as if cataloging it for later use. And she was enjoying nothing, but observing everything. Briggs, who had spent decades in leadership positions, had never been scrutinized like this. Not in the Pentagon, not in war zones, not by any general or superior officer. Yet here he was, feeling a sense of vulnerability that was foreign, uncomfortable. The sergeant cleared his throat. Briggs barely noticed. "Colonel, shall we proceed with the afternoon training review?" Briggs snapped his attention back. "Yes, of course. Carry on," he barked, though his confidence felt shakier than he cared to admit. The afternoon moved like a careful dance. The woman asked precise questions, requested access to certain personnel files, and noted minor procedural issues that had gone unnoticed under Briggs's command. Each observation was accurate. Each question was pointed, and every time he tried to assert control, she deflected it with calm, unshakable poise. By sunset, the rumors on the base had begun to swell. Whispers spread that she was no ordinary oversight liaison, that she had connections to the highest echelons of the Pentagon. Some claimed she was intelligence, others speculated she was political. One thing was certain: she walked with authority that no rank on this base could match. Briggs stormed back to his office, muttering under his breath, "She can't just walk in and undermine me. Not like this." He slammed the door behind him and sank into his chair, fists clenching the arms. He didn't realize the unease in his stomach, the way a cold, unfamiliar knot had formed, warning him that he was about to face something he had never faced before. Outside, the last rays of sun dipped below the horizon. The woman continued her inspection, quietly taking notes, moving through the corridors with a presence that demanded attention without uttering a single command. And Briggs knew, though he refused to admit it aloud, that his day, his authority, and perhaps his career were teetering on the edge of a revelation he could not yet comprehend. Because he didn't know her name. He didn't know her purpose. And most importantly, he didn't know the rank she truly held. But he would. Soon. And when he did, everything he thought he knew about control, respect, and power would be shattered. The morning air was sharp and brisk as the woman followed a young sergeant through the hallways of Fort Ralston. The walls echoed with the sound of their boots against the polished floors, but each step she took seemed deliberate, unhurried, a quiet defiance to the rigid urgency of military time. Colonel Briggs trailed behind them, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched, his pride wounded by the knowledge that she had ignored his authority, intentionally or not, and he could not yet determine which. "Ma'am, you might want to pick up the pace," he barked, his voice slicing through the hallway like a whip. "This isn't a yoga class." Her head turned slightly, lips curling into the smallest, polite smile. "I walk at the speed I choose, Colonel," she said, her voice calm, even, and firm. There was no hesitation, no flinching, only quiet command. A few soldiers turned their heads, exchanging uneasy glances. The air around Briggs felt heavier, as if the room itself recognized the shift in power. His usual methods, mocking, sarcasm, intimidation, were having little effect, and that more than anything sent a spike of unease through him. "Oh, we've got a feisty one," he muttered under his breath, a bark of laughter escaping him that carried down the hall. He leaned closer to the sergeant escorting her, trying to appear casual. "Let me guess. HR, training compliance. Maybe just another pencil pusher who thinks she can walk through a military base and tell soldiers how to do their jobs." She didn't reply, not a word. Her silence was sharper than any insult he could throw. It was an invisible blade slicing into his ego, and it only made him more determined to assert dominance. When they reached the briefing room, Briggs was ready. He threw open the door, letting it bang against the wall. "Welcome to your first real taste of the Army," he said, voice dripping with mockery. "Try not to slow us down, sweetheart." The room was tense. Officers and soldiers froze mid-step, sensing the storm about to unfold. But the woman removed her sunglasses slowly, deliberately, her gaze meeting Briggs's directly. There was no fear, no uncertainty. Only clarity, a quiet assessment that made him shift in his boots. "Fascinating," she murmured, almost to herself. Then louder she addressed him directly. "Your leadership style is concerning." Briggs blinked. "Concerning? Do you even understand what it takes to run a base like this?" he barked, stepping closer. His face was red, voice rising. "I've been doing this for years. Years. Don't sit there acting like you know anything." Her eyes never wavered. She wrote a few lines in her notebook, her movements precise, methodical. "I do understand," she replied evenly. "And I'm here to make sure that the people under your command are being treated with professionalism and respect. That's my job." "Professionalism and respect," Briggs barked. "I've built this place from the ground up. My men respect me. Fear is part of discipline." He gestured wildly, knocking over a pen holder in his agitation. "You have no idea what it takes to command." "I observe," she interrupted softly but with unmistakable authority. "And what I see is not leadership. It is control through intimidation. That is not the same thing." For a moment the room was silent. The officer's presence shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Briggs felt his blood boil. Nobody had ever spoken to him like this in his own command. And yet, the more he tried to lash out verbally, the more composed she remained. "You mock me," she continued, her tone even, almost clinical. "You mock the very people you are supposed to guide. You mistake fear for loyalty. That is dangerous for them. And for you." Briggs's face went from red to pale. "Dangerous? Who do you think you are telling me what's dangerous?" Her eyes locked on his, unwavering. "Someone who has the authority to ensure that you follow the rules, Colonel, and someone who has the experience to recognize when a leader is failing." He laughed, but it was hollow, forced. "Experience? You're a civilian. What experience could you possibly have in combat in command?" A faint smile touched her lips, not mocking but almost imperceptibly knowing. Experience is not always measured in combat. Sometimes it is measured in oversight, in understanding the patterns of human behavior, in seeing consequences before they arrive. I have both." Briggs clenched his fists. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the familiar surge of anger that had always fueled him. But now, for the first time in years, it was mingled with uncertainty, a sense that he was no longer in complete control. The sergeant who had escorted her cleared his throat nervously. Briggs ignored him. The tension in the room was palpable. He wanted to assert dominance, to remind everyone, including himself, that he was in charge. But every time he opened his mouth, she met his words with a calm, deliberate observation that cut through him like a scalpel. Finally, she closed her notebook and looked at him with quiet finality. "Colonel Briggs, you may think you are untouchable within these walls, but I assure you, no one is beyond accountability." Briggs opened his mouth to respond, to roar some retort that would reassert his dominance. But the words died on his lips as the intercom buzzed. A voice, crisp and unfamiliar, echoed through the room. "Colonel Briggs, report to Building 1 immediately. This is an official order." Briggs froze. The voice didn't belong to his chain of command. Not at all. He glanced at the woman. She simply nodded slightly, a gesture that was both courteous and chillingly confident. The air seemed to grow colder, charged with an unseen energy. The soldiers in the room shifted nervously. Briggs realized, with an uncomfortable twist in his stomach, that he was being called to account in a way he had never experienced before. He took a step back, trying to mask the unease that crept through him. "Building 1, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Who even?" The woman walked past him without a word, calm, collected, the picture of poise and quiet authority. Briggs's boots echoed hollowly behind her, but for the first time, the echo felt like the sound of his own power crumbling. As he followed her out of the briefing room, the whispers started. Soldiers, previously silent, exchanged glances. Their eyes flicked to him, to her, to the hallways they traversed. Some were speculating, others just watching, unsure what this encounter meant for their own positions. But Briggs could feel it. The uncertainty, the shift in attention, the subtle fear that maybe, just maybe, his command was no longer absolute. The woman paused at the edge of the courtyard, looking out over the rows of vehicles and soldiers assembling for evening drills. Briggs noticed her stance, relaxed, commanding, utterly composed. She wasn't walking in to assert herself. She was walking in to observe, and her observation carried weight beyond anything he had ever encountered. For a long moment, Briggs stood in the sunlight, fists still clenched, chest heaving. Every instinct screamed at him to confront her, to assert dominance, to re-establish control. But another part, a quieter, more unnerving part, whispered that this was different. This was not a routine inspection. This was something far bigger than him. A gust of wind swept through the courtyard, tossing papers and debris. The helicopter that had brought her earlier lifted off, leaving a strange emptiness in its wake. Briggs stared after it, a sense of foreboding settling over him. Something had changed, though he didn't yet know what. Because he still didn't know her name. He didn't know her purpose. And most importantly, he had no idea the scale of authority she wielded, or the consequences that awaited him. And yet in the pit of his stomach he felt it, a warning, an inevitability. He was about to learn, in the most humiliating and career-altering way imaginable, that mocking her would be the gravest mistake of his life. The woman turned her gaze slightly, not at him, not at the base, but into the distance, observing, calculating. Briggs realized with a mix of fear and disbelief that she had already seen him, fully. And soon the rest of the world would too. By mid-morning, the atmosphere at Fort Ralston had changed entirely. Soldiers moved through the base with cautious, almost nervous precision, exchanging subtle glances as they whispered under their breath. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the woman was CIA. Others claimed she was a Pentagon legal officer. A few whispered, almost in awe, that she was a political appointee with unprecedented access to the highest echelons of the military. All anyone could agree on was that she carried herself with quiet authority, speaking rarely but commanding attention with every word and gesture. Colonel Briggs, however, refused to acknowledge the growing murmurs. He doubled down on his usual bravado, striding through the halls with a forced air of confidence. But even he could feel the tension twisting around him like a tightening coil. The soldiers' eyes were no longer just watching. They were calculating, evaluating how their colonel, so often untouchable, reacted to someone far outside the chain of command. During a morning training review, the woman asked a few precise questions about unit logistics and personnel readiness. Briggs interrupted her, as he had done countless times with junior officers, with sharp, cutting sarcasm. "Ma'am," he said, voice raised, "maybe you should let the professionals handle this. After all, this isn't a classroom exercise." The woman looked at him steadily, unflinching. "I am here to observe, Colonel. I'm also here to ensure that your team is being led effectively." "Effectively?" Briggs bellowed. "I've been running this base longer than you've probably been in uniform. Don't tell me how to do my job." A few lieutenants winced, hiding a smile behind their hands. Some of them had already been briefed by her privately in hushed tones and were aware that this woman, who appeared unassuming and calm, was something else entirely. She was not here merely to oversee. She was here to evaluate, to dissect, to expose any weakness. And Briggs was giving her exactly the kind of behavior she needed to do it. By mid-afternoon, the whispers became impossible to ignore. Officers exchanged hurried conversations in the hallways, glancing at her and then at Briggs. "Do you know who she is?" one whispered. "I've heard she has clearance even generals respect," said another. Briggs caught snippets of these murmurs and felt a sting of unease. He had always been untouchable. Even when reprimanded, it was rarely in a way that embarrassed him in front of his subordinates. Now, the base was alive with speculation, and it all revolved around a single person, someone he had consistently mocked, dismissed, and underestimated. During personnel inspections, the woman moved quietly but deliberately, observing soldiers' actions and taking meticulous notes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't issue orders. And yet every soldier straightened, every sergeant hesitated, every lieutenant glanced up as if waiting for her approval. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the shift in authority was unmistakable. Briggs noticed it, of course. He was infuriated. By late afternoon, she requested access to a series of highly classified personnel files. Briggs rolled his eyes dramatically and muttered under his breath, "Curious kitten, aren't we?" The comment earned a few glances from passing officers, a mixture of amusement and shock at the condescending tone he had used. She ignored the remark entirely, flipping through the files with precision. "I need to review these records to understand the patterns of command, Colonel. Your decisions and interactions with subordinates are part of my assessment." Briggs felt his jaw tighten. "Patterns? My patterns are fine, my command is fine. I don't need someone observing me like a lab rat." The woman's gaze met his, unwavering. "Sometimes, Colonel, those who believe they lead effectively fail to see the damage they cause. Observation is the only way to discern truth from illusion." Her words hit him harder than any insult could. This was no ordinary civilian. She was calm, composed, and analytical, and she was quietly dismantling his sense of authority piece by piece. He had mocked countless officers in his career, humiliated others to assert dominance, but he had never faced someone who would sit in silence, watch, and strike precisely at the weak points of his ego. Then, just as he was beginning to feel cornered, something extraordinary happened. High-ranking officers from the regional command arrived unexpectedly. They weren't visiting for the usual inspection or routine meetings. They were here to meet with her, behind closed doors in the secure conference room. Briggs, unaware of the details, approached the room and peeked inside. He saw their silhouettes against the frosted glass, standing rigidly, almost in deference. And she, unflinching, calm, confident, was among them. Briggs froze. His stomach knotted. He had encountered generals before, but never had he seen them wait in that way, deferential, silent, as if the presence of someone entirely outside the chain of command demanded respect. And that someone was a civilian, or at least appeared to be. He backed away slowly, trying to process what he was seeing. Then one of the generals noticed him through the glass. The blinds snapped closed, sealing the room from view. Briggs's unease skyrocketed. He realized with a rising sense of panic that he was not privy to whatever was being discussed, and whatever it was, it carried immense weight. As he walked back down the hallway, he could feel every eye on him. Soldiers and officers alike whispered, speculated, and stole glances. Even the usual morning bravado felt hollow. Something had shifted. The balance of power had subtly, unmistakably, tilted away from him. He returned to his office, slamming the door behind him, fists clenched on the edge of the desk. The room, once a sanctuary of authority, now felt stifling. He replayed every interaction of the day, every comment, every calculated silence from her, and the weight of it pressed against his chest. For the first time in years, Briggs was not in control. He stared at the computer screen, the blinking cursor mocking him in its quiet persistence. The emails, the files, the procedural reports, everything he had meticulously maintained for years, suddenly seemed insufficient. She had arrived unseen, unannounced, and within hours, she had insinuated herself into the heart of his authority, quietly observing, recording, analyzing. A knock on the door startled him. "Colonel Briggs," a voice said, hesitant. You've been called to Building 1, immediately." Briggs froze. The words were simple, but they carried a resonance he could not ignore. Building 1 was a secure facility, reserved for the highest levels of command. Only those with exceptional clearance were summoned there without warning. He had never been called in this manner before. The woman, who had been quietly reviewing documents on a side table, looked up and offered a slight nod. Briggs felt a shiver travel down his spine. Her composure, her calm, the precision of her movements, it was as though she had anticipated this moment all along. He swallowed hard, trying to muster his usual bravado. "Building 1, he repeated. What's going on?" She simply turned and walked toward the door, her steps measured, deliberate, and authoritative. Briggs realized, with a rising pit in his stomach, that following her meant surrendering control, walking into the unknown, and facing someone whose power he could not yet comprehend. As he followed, soldiers and officers watched in silence. The hallway seemed longer than usual, the shadows darker, the air thick with unspoken tension. Every step he took behind her felt like a step closer to a reckoning he was ill-prepared for. And as they reached the end of the corridor, Briggs realized something terrifyingly clear. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her purpose. And most critically, he had no idea the authority she wielded. But he would find out. Soon. And when he did, everything he believed about command, respect, and power would be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. By the next morning, the tension across Fort Ralston was palpable. Even the air seemed charged, vibrating with whispers and stolen glances. Soldiers moved in measured steps. Officers exchanged quick, nervous murmurs in the hallways, and the echo of boots against the polished concrete seemed louder than usual, as if the base itself was aware that something monumental was unfolding. Colonel Briggs, however, refused to acknowledge it. He had built his reputation on unwavering authority, a command style that brooked no dissent, no challenge. But today, even he couldn't ignore the shifting atmosphere. Every interaction, every glance, every hushed whisper seemed to question him in a way that was impossible to dismiss. His office was a fortress of papers, awards, and plaques, each item a monument to his decades of service. Yet even here, surrounded by symbols of authority, he felt uneasy. His fists clenched on the edge of his desk as he muttered under his breath, packing back and forth. "She can't just walk in and undermine me. Not like this." Briggs's XO, a quiet man with a knack for sensing tension before it became visible, stepped cautiously into the office. "Sir," he said, almost whispering, "the liaison, she's still conducting her reviews. She's been thorough, and some of the officers you supervise have already spoken to her privately." Briggs spun toward him, eyes blazing. "Spoken to her privately? She can't be doing that. I command this base." "Sir, with all due respect," the XO replied carefully, "the instructions came from above. She has the authority to conduct her review as she sees fit." Briggs felt heat rush to his face, a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Above who?" he demanded. "Above you, sir," the XO said softly, almost too softly. The words struck Briggs like a thunderclap. He opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came. His chest tightened as the gravity of the statement sank in. Someone above him, Not another colonel, not a general, but someone with authority far beyond his own, was conducting an evaluation of his leadership, and he had no say in the matter. Briggs stormed down the hallway, boots pounding against the polished concrete. He needed answers. He needed to assert his dominance before the whispers of the base became unbearable, and most of all, he needed to confront her. He found her calmly reviewing documents in the operations center, completely undisturbed by his dramatic entrance. Her posture was impeccable, movements deliberate, the quiet command in her presence almost suffocating. "That's enough," he barked, voice low but dangerous. "You don't run this base, I do." She looked up at him unflinching, calm, polished, ruthlessly confident. "And that is exactly what concerns me," she said. Briggs's face reddened. "I don't know who you think you are, but I will not be spoken to like that in my own command." She closed the folder she had been reviewing, standing with an almost imperceptible grace. "You're right," she said softly. "This should be your command." Briggs blinked, confused. "Should be," he repeated, his voice cracking. She stepped closer, still calm, still deliberate. "For now." The words hit him like a physical blow. His control, his authority, the very identity he had built over decades of service, it was being stripped from him in the quietest, most precise way imaginable. What is that supposed to mean?" he demanded, fists tightening at his sides. She tilted her head slightly, eyes assessing him, but never with malice. "It means your leadership is under review," she said simply, "and so far your behavior has clarified things." Briggs's jaw tightened. You don't have the authority for that," he said, though the certainty in his voice was weakened by the rising panic in his chest. "I do," she replied evenly. For the first time in his life, Briggs felt the weight of uncertainty press down on him. The air seemed heavier, the walls closer, and the realization hit him. He was no longer the uncontested force he had always believed himself to be. The base, the officers, the soldiers, they were watching, waiting, and silently judging him. And he had no armor to protect his pride, no shield to defend his ego. The intercom crackled to life, cutting through the tension. "Colonel Briggs, report to Building 1, immediately." The voice was crisp, direct, unyielding. It wasn't someone in his chain of command. It wasn't his superior colonel, his peers, or anyone he recognized. The gravity of the summons sent a shiver down his spine. The woman gave him a subtle nod, then turned and walked toward the door with the same quiet, unshakable authority she had carried all day. Briggs, chest tight and mind racing, followed. Each step down the corridor felt like a march toward an inevitable reckoning, and the whispers of the base seemed to echo in his ears. Outside, soldiers paused in their duties to glance at the unfolding scene. Officers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The tension in the air was almost visible, coiling around Briggs like smoke, pressing him toward the unknown. Building 1 loomed ahead, a fortress of authority that only the highest echelons could enter. Its doors were reinforced, its access restricted. And now Briggs was being summoned there by someone whose authority he had underestimated, for reasons he could only guess at. Inside, the atmosphere was markedly different from the rest of the base. Security officers moved with quiet precision, the hum of electronics and the low murmur of distant conversations forming a strange symphony of power. As they approached the main chamber, Briggs's palms grew sweaty. This was unfamiliar territory. Every instinct in him screamed caution, yet his pride urged defiance. When the doors opened, Briggs stepped into a room he would never forget. High-ranking generals stood waiting, their posture impeccable, their expressions unreadable. And there, at the center of the room, the woman stood with perfect composure. Her presence radiated authority that far exceeded anything Briggs had ever encountered. Briggs's mouth went dry. This was no routine inspection. This was a gathering of the most powerful figures he had ever seen, convened in a room that symbolized ultimate control. And the woman, calm, composed, and terrifyingly precise, was at the center. She regarded him with quiet intensity. "Colonel Briggs," she said, voice measured and deliberate, "you've been under routine command review for 6 months. Multiple complaints regarding your conduct have been noted." Briggs felt the ground tilt beneath him. His chest tightened, his hands trembled slightly. "Complaints? That's nonsense." A lieutenant general raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "Colonel, you will not interrupt," he said. The authority in his voice left no room for argument. The woman slid a folder across the table toward Briggs. Its edges were crisp, marked with a red stripe that screamed top secret. Briggs's hands hovered above it, reluctant to touch what he felt might seal his fate. Before he could react, the woman's voice cut through the room like steel. "Before you speak, Colonel, you should know who I am." Briggs's stomach dropped. He felt a cold twist of fear that he had not known in years. The revelation would come in moments, and when it did, his world would change forever. The room held its breath. And Briggs realized, with a chill he couldn't ignore, that he was about to face the consequences of a career built on fear, mockery, and the illusion of invincibility. Building 1 loomed larger than any structure Briggs had ever entered. Its polished floors gleamed under harsh overhead lights, reflecting the tension coiling inside him like a spring ready to snap. Normally, only the highest-ranking officers had clearance to step foot in this chamber, a room whose walls had heard whispered strategies that had shaped nations, whose tables had hosted decisions that determined life and death. Today, Briggs was walking into it uninvited, summoned by someone whose authority he had foolishly underestimated. He stepped through the doors expecting some perfunctory review. Instead, he froze mid-step. 4 generals, senior officers whose mere presence would normally command respect even from Briggs, stood waiting. Upright, formal, alert, their faces unreadable. And standing among them, calm, composed, and radiating an authority that made the air itself feel heavy, was the woman. Briggs's eyes narrowed. He took a breath, trying to assert himself to regain some semblance of command. What is this? Why are they here?" His voice, usually commanding, faltered under the weight of unfamiliar authority. She turned to him slowly, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Colonel Briggs," she said, voice smooth and precise, "you have been under review for your conduct as the commanding officer at Fort Ralston." Briggs's stomach twisted. "Conduct? My conduct is exemplary. I've built this base, trained these men, shaped careers. I am responsible for every success here." She didn't flinch. Instead, she lifted a folder with a red stripe, sliding it toward him across the polished table. "Before we proceed, you need to understand the full extent of your actions. The complaints filed against you are extensive. They cover repeated incidents of abusive language, retaliation against subordinates, and a pattern of behavior that is unsustainable." Briggs felt his knees weaken. "This is absurd, I demand." A lieutenant general raised his hand sharply, silencing him. "Colonel, do not interrupt. You will hear the facts before defending yourself." The woman opened the folder, flipping it to the first page, her movements deliberate and precise. These documents contain reports from multiple officers and enlisted personnel, detailing incidents where your behavior compromised unit cohesion and morale. Each report was verified independently. Each reflects a pattern that cannot be ignored. Briggs's jaw tightened. They're exaggerations, lies, fabrications. She regarded him without judgment. "They are not exaggerations. They are recorded facts. Your command style has created fear where there should be respect, intimidation where there should be mentorship, and belittlement where there should be guidance." The room was silent, every officer watching the exchange with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Briggs's usual arsenal of threats, sarcasm, and intimidation felt useless here. He was no longer the center of authority. He was being dissected, observed, judged by someone whose presence alone demanded compliance. He struggled to find footing, voice rising in desperation. "I am the commanding officer. I have the rank, the experience. I've been here longer than anyone." The woman interjected, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Rank does not excuse misconduct. Experience does not justify fear-driven leadership. You have been given every opportunity to correct your course, yet the pattern remains." Briggs felt his world tilting. For decades his authority had been absolute, his control unchallenged. Now, in a room filled with the highest-ranking officers he had ever encountered, he was small, vulnerable, exposed. Then she said the words that made his stomach drop entirely. "Colonel Briggs, you are relieved of command." The air seemed to freeze. Even the hum of the ventilation system felt distant, muffled. Briggs's eyes widened. "Relieved? This is impossible." The lieutenant general who had silenced him before added, "Effective immediately, Colonel. You will be reassigned pending further review. Full cooperation is expected." Briggs's fists clenched, trembling slightly. "My career, my life's work, you cannot." The woman stepped closer, her presence commanding without aggression. "Colonel, you chose this outcome. Every insult, every belittling comment, every abuse of authority you permitted has consequences. I simply observed the pattern and brought it to those with the power to act." Briggs felt as if the floor had fallen away beneath him. The room, once a distant realm of abstract authority, was now a cage in which his own career and pride had been stripped bare. He took a step back, head bowed, trying to process the humiliation. For the first time in decades, he was not the one in control. Every officer watching him, every soldier on the base whispering behind closed doors had seen his fall begin. The woman's voice softened, not with sympathy but with precision. "You will report to the Leadership Rehabilitation Program. It is rigorous. It is designed to teach leaders like you that respect is earned, not demanded, and that authority without humility is destructive." Briggs's throat tightened. "Rehabilitation, you can't." "You will comply," she said, her eyes locking with his. "Or your career, your reputation, and your command will end entirely. The choice is yours, humility and growth, or stagnation and consequence." He swallowed hard, the reality settling in. The commanding officer who had ruled this base for years, feared by subordinates and peers alike, was now powerless in the face of a truth he had refused to acknowledge. Leadership is about more than rank, more than fear, more than ego. A silence stretched over the room. The generals, the officers, even the woman herself seemed to hold their breath, as if the moment hung suspended in time. Finally she spoke again. "Colonel Briggs, there is one final lesson I hope you take from today. Authority without character is meaningless. Fear is temporary. Respect endures." Briggs looked around the room, at faces he had respected, at soldiers he had commanded, at the woman whose quiet power had dismantled him piece by piece. A strange mix of shame, disbelief, and faint hope stirred in his chest. He felt the weight of every choice he had made, every insult he had thrown, every subordinate he had demeaned. And he understood with a clarity he had never known that the fall he faced was not punishment. It was instruction. It was a test of the man he could still become. The woman stepped back, giving him space, and nodded once. "Prepare to leave for the program, Colonel. Your journey begins now." The generals silently acknowledged her, then turned their attention back to Briggs, their faces unreadable but firm. Every instinct screamed at him to resist, to rage, to defy. But he realized, too late, that the path forward demanded something he had never practiced: humility. Briggs exhaled, trembling, and nodded. The room seemed to shift, the weight of authority settling firmly on shoulders that had never carried such truth before. As he turned to leave, the woman's voice followed him, low, deliberate, and unforgettable. "Remember this, Colonel, leadership is not about fear. It is about accountability, and it begins with recognizing the limits of your own power." He walked toward the door, chest heavy, mind racing. For the first time, he was not the king of Fort Ralston. He was a man forced to confront himself, stripped of rank in the eyes of authority, and confronted by a truth he could not escape. Outside the room, the soldiers and officers waited, whispers filling the hallways, some fearful, some amazed. The news of what had just transpired would ripple through the base, leaving a mark on every career, every relationship, every whispered conversation. And somewhere deep inside, Briggs knew this was not the end. It was the beginning. Colonel Briggs had never felt smaller. Even as he walked back through the base he had commanded for years, the polished concrete beneath his boots felt unfamiliar, the air heavy with unspoken judgment. Soldiers and officers avoided his gaze, whispering to one another as he passed. For the first time in his life, he felt invisible, powerless, and painfully aware that the illusion of control he had relied on for decades had evaporated in a single morning. The woman walked ahead of him, calm, precise, exuding a quiet authority that seemed to bend the very air around her. Briggs's pride screamed at him to assert himself, to bark orders, to reclaim even a fragment of control, but every instinct told him it was useless. He was following someone whose presence made generals defer, whose silence carried more weight than his loudest commands. Finally, she stopped outside a secure briefing room, its doors marked with a red stripe and security codes that even Briggs had never seen accessed so casually. She turned to him, expression neutral but eyes sharp, piercing. "Colonel Briggs," she said, voice low, deliberate. "Before you proceed, you need to understand exactly who you are dealing with." Briggs's throat tightened. "I don't care who you are," he muttered, voice cracking slightly. "I've faced worse than you." A faint smile appeared, though it was not mocking, just faintly knowing. "You haven't faced me, Colonel. Not in a position where your actions, your ego, and your power are measured against the highest standards of accountability." She pressed a button on her tablet. The door slid open automatically. Inside, the room was bathed in cold, fluorescent light. A long table dominated the center, and at it sat several figures whose presence alone would have made Briggs falter. Senior officers, military lawyers, intelligence officials. Their gazes were calm but penetrating, the kind that weighed every word, every gesture, every inflection. Briggs's pulse accelerated. He had been summoned here before, but never like this. Never with the entire room waiting for him to stumble, for him to explain himself, for the truth of his failures to be laid bare. The woman led him to the table and gestured for him to sit. "Colonel," she said softly, "your command style has been under scrutiny for some time. The reports we've gathered are extensive, and the conclusions drawn from them are conclusive." Briggs's hands shook as he lowered himself into the chair. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, barely audible. "I've served my entire life. I've led men in combat." "Yes," she said, voice calm. "And in those arenas your leadership was unquestionable. But leadership in peace, leadership in administration, leadership over people in a controlled environment, it is measured differently. Fear is not the same as respect. Intimidation is not the same as guidance, and rank does not excuse failure." Briggs exhaled sharply, chest tight, mind racing. "Then who are you to judge me? What is your rank?" The room went silent. The other officials exchanged glances, some almost imperceptibly nodding to one another. And then she said the words that froze him in his seat. "I outrank you, Colonel, by miles." Briggs blinked. What do you mean?" "I am a brigadier general," she said, her voice steady, precise. "You are a colonel. Every insult you have thrown, every belittling remark, every act of mockery directed at me, was directed at someone who outranks you, and whose authority extends well beyond this base, beyond your chain of command, beyond what you could ever imagine." The weight of her words slammed into him. His pride, his ego, his entire sense of identity as the undisputed master of Fort Ralston cracked. He felt dizzy, as if the walls themselves were tilting, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. For decades, he had measured himself against his peers, his subordinates, his own sense of self-worth. And now, in an instant, it had all been invalidated. "You," he stammered, struggling for breath, "you're a general." "Yes," she said softly. "And as a general, I am accountable for your actions, your behavior toward your subordinates, your treatment of officers under your command, your reliance on fear and intimidation rather than respect and guidance. It is my responsibility to intervene when such patterns are identified. That responsibility begins with you." Briggs's chest tightened, his fists clenching on the edge of the table. He had mocked others relentlessly in his career. He had humiliated subordinates, belittled peers, and undermined officers to assert dominance. And now, the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had done all of that to someone who outranked him, whose authority was absolute and whose judgment was final. The room was silent. The other officials watched, expressions calm but unyielding. Briggs could feel their eyes on him, weighing every reaction, measuring every tremor of fear, every faltering heartbeat. The woman's presence dominated the space, and in that presence he felt powerless in a way he had never felt before. "Colonel Briggs," she continued, "your career is not over yet. You have the opportunity to learn, to correct your course, and to understand what leadership truly requires. But make no mistake, every choice you make from this moment forward will be scrutinized. Every action will be measured against the standards of accountability, integrity, and respect." Briggs swallowed hard, nodding slowly. His mind was racing, a storm of shame, disbelief, and grudging acknowledgement. For the first time, he was seeing himself through the eyes of someone whose authority could not be challenged, whose judgment could not be dismissed, and whose patience was not infinite. "Your actions," she said, leaning slightly forward, "have consequences. The training program you will now attend is rigorous. It is designed to reshape leaders like you, those who rely on fear instead of respect, on intimidation instead of guidance. If you fail to embrace it, your career, your reputation, and your command will be destroyed entirely." Briggs's throat tightened, his voice barely audible. "And if I succeed?" The woman's eyes softened ever so slightly, though her authority remained absolute. "If you succeed, you will understand what leadership truly is. You will regain respect, not through fear but through earned trust. And you may yet reclaim a place of influence, but only if you embrace humility, accountability, and integrity." For the first time in decades, Briggs felt a flicker of something he had long ignored, the possibility of redemption. But it came at a cost he had never imagined, the crushing humiliation of being bested, exposed, and humbled by someone he had mocked, underestimated, and belittled. The room fell silent again. The other officials returned to their paperwork, leaving Briggs alone with the brigadier general who had upended his entire sense of self. Finally she stood. "Your first session begins tomorrow. Be prepared. Your journey starts here." Briggs exhaled slowly, shoulders heavy with the weight of his mistakes. The woman turned and walked toward the door, every step calm, deliberate, and commanding. He followed, knowing that the path forward would test every part of him, the pride, the ego, the experience, and the very definition of who he thought he was. As they exited the room, the whispering officers outside fell silent, sensing the gravity of what had just transpired. The base itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would become of the colonel who had once ruled with fear, and who now faced the consequences of his arrogance. Briggs glanced at her, heart pounding. The revelation of her rank had shattered everything he thought he knew about power, authority, and respect. And yet, despite the humiliation, a part of him, a stubborn, unyielding part, still clung to the hope that he could survive this, that he could learn, that he could somehow reclaim the man he thought he was. But deep down, he knew, nothing would ever be the same. Colonel Briggs had never felt so exposed in his life. The Leadership Rehabilitation Program, as it was officially called, was a crucible designed to strip away arrogance, ego, and pretense, leaving only the raw essence of command and accountability. And from the moment he stepped into the austere facility, he realized that this was nothing like the structured inspections or military exercises he had orchestrated for decades. The room was cold, minimalist. No plaques, no decorations, no reminders of rank or power. Only a long table, a set of chairs, and a series of screens lining the walls. The screens displayed real-time footage of officers and soldiers across Fort Ralston, all of them moving through their routines, their efficiency, their morale, and all of it under silent observation. The woman, the brigadier general whose authority had already humbled him, stood at the head of the table. She was calm, composed, deliberate, radiating a presence that filled the room entirely. "Colonel Briggs," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness, "your trial begins now." Briggs's jaw tightened. "Trial," he echoed, though a flicker of fear crept through his voice. "Yes," she said simply. "This program is designed to expose the weaknesses in your leadership, to challenge your assumptions, and to rebuild your command from the ground up. You will be evaluated continuously. Every decision, every interaction, every choice will be scrutinized. Failure is not an option." Briggs exhaled sharply, trying to steady himself. He had faced combat, hostile territories, and countless missions where lives hung by a thread, but nothing had prepared him for this. Leadership, he realized, was not about weapons, strategies, or brute force. It was about people, and for decades he had misread the simplest truths. Respect is earned, not demanded. Loyalty is cultivated, not coerced. Fear is fleeting, respect endures. The first exercise began immediately. A series of real-time scenarios were displayed on the screens, simulations of crises across the base. A medical emergency, a mechanical failure on a vehicle convoy, a miscommunication between platoons. Each scenario required rapid decision-making, problem-solving, and delegation. Briggs's first instinct was to bark orders, to assert control through volume and force. But before he could, the brigadier general stopped him with a quiet gesture. "Colonel," she said, her tone firm yet calm, "your role is to guide, not dominate. Observe, assess, and empower your subordinates to act effectively. Your decisions should foster initiative, not fear." The words hit him like a hammer. His decades of command had relied on intimidation, on asserting authority by making others uncertain of their standing. Now, he was being forced to rethink everything he had ever known. A timer began counting down. The scenarios accelerated. Reports came in from various units across the base. A soldier was injured during training, a vehicle convoy had broken down, communications were garbled between multiple teams. Briggs's hands shook slightly as he began issuing instructions, but this time he tried something different. Instead of ordering, he asked questions. Instead of assuming, he listened. "Lieutenant, what resources do you need to stabilize the convoy?" he asked, his voice steady but lacking the usual arrogance. The lieutenant, surprised by the shift, responded clearly, detailing the equipment, personnel, and logistics required. Briggs acknowledged the response, then addressed a sergeant. "Coordinate with the lieutenant. Ensure your team is ready to support. Do you understand the plan?" The sergeant nodded, visibly relieved to be included rather than ordered around. Briggs could feel the shift in energy. The soldiers were responding, cooperating rather than fearing, engaging rather than hesitating. The brigadier general observed silently, arms crossed, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "Notice the difference?" she asked softly, more to Briggs than anyone else. He nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, I." "You are learning," she said, her voice calm, almost imperceptible. "But observation is only the beginning. You must internalize this. Authority without respect is meaningless." The next scenario escalated the pressure. A simulated hostage situation at the base required rapid negotiation, strategic planning, and emotional intelligence. Briggs felt panic rising. His instinct was to assert dominance, to issue orders, to force compliance. But he remembered her words, the shift he had felt during the convoy scenario. He took a deep breath, scanning the team. Lieutenant, assess the perimeter. Sergeant, keep communication channels open. We need clarity before we act. The team moved efficiently. For the first time, Briggs felt a surge of understanding, not relief, not pride, but a subtle recognition that he was seeing leadership differently. This was not about asserting power. It was about empowering others. Hours passed in a relentless cascade of trials, each scenario designed to strip away arrogance and expose flaws. At every turn, the Brigadier General observed silently, intervening only with subtle guidance, never harsh judgment. Briggs felt both frustrated and humbled. Each mistake, each hesitation was magnified. Every correct decision brought not relief, but the realization that he had barely scratched the surface of understanding true leadership. By evening, Briggs was exhausted, mentally and physically. Sweat clung to his brow, muscles ached, and his mind was racing with the enormity of what he had just experienced. But he could not ignore the subtle changes he felt within himself. The recognition that fear was not loyalty, that respect required cultivation, and that authority carried responsibility far beyond personal pride. The Brigadier General finally spoke, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of monitors and activity. Colonel Briggs, today you have made progress, but this is only the beginning. Leadership is not measured in hours, exercises, or simulations. It is measured every day, in every choice, in every interaction with those who depend on you. Briggs nodded, swallowing hard. His pride was bruised, his ego battered, but a flicker of determination sparked in his chest. He realized that the program was not merely a punishment. It was a chance to rebuild, to reclaim some part of the command he had lost, and to understand what it truly meant to lead. As he exited the room, sweat-drenched and exhausted, he caught glimpses of soldiers and officers watching through the observation windows. Some whispered, some stared in awe, some in disbelief. But Briggs barely noticed. His focus was inward, grappling with the lessons that had been delivered in the most intense, uncompromising manner possible. Outside, the Brigadier General walked beside him, her presence calm, measured, and utterly commanding. "Tomorrow, the intensity will increase," she said. "Your patience, humility, and judgment will be tested further. And make no mistake, Colonel, every misstep will be recorded, every choice evaluated, and every lesson reinforced. This is the reality of leadership." Briggs exhaled, feeling the weight of her words settle like stone. For the first time, he understood that the path forward was not about reclaiming power through fear, but through accountability, respect, and self-awareness. As he returned to his temporary quarters, he felt the duality of exhaustion and awakening. He had been humbled, exposed, and stripped of the ego that had long defined him. Yet in that very exposure, he felt the first glimmers of transformation, a chance to rebuild not just his career, but himself. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the hardest trials were yet to come. Because leadership, he now understood, was not a crown to wear, but a weight to bear. The sun had barely risen over Fort Ralston, painting the base in pale streaks of orange and gold. Yet Colonel Briggs was already awake, reviewing every lesson from the previous day. The leadership rehabilitation program had pushed him to the brink of physical and mental exhaustion, forcing him to confront decades of arrogance, fear-driven authority, and ego-driven mistakes. Every step he took across the base felt different. Where before he had walked with certainty, now every glance, every gesture, every decision carried weight. Soldiers and officers watched him carefully, not in fear but in curiosity. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and oddly alive. The Brigadier General, calm as ever, appeared beside him. Her presence no longer carried the intimidating mystery of the first day. Instead, it radiated a quiet authority that demanded reflection. "Today," she said softly, "your final assessment begins. This is where you either embrace the truth of leadership or prove yourself unworthy of it." Briggs nodded, swallowing hard. He had faced battles, crises, and hostile territories, yet nothing had prepared him for this, the battlefield of his own ego, dissected and exposed. He understood now that leadership was not about rank, not about fear, not about mockery. It was about accountability, respect, and the capacity to inspire others to act with integrity. The first trial of the day was unprecedented. A simulated base-wide crisis had been initiated, involving multiple emergencies happening simultaneously. A security breach at a sensitive facility, a medical emergency in the barracks, and a logistics breakdown threatening essential operations. Each scenario required rapid decision-making, delegation, and composure under pressure. Briggs's instincts surged. His first impulse was to bark orders to take control through sheer force, but he caught himself. He had learned the lessons painfully. Intimidation created compliance, but it did not create trust or respect. Instead, he surveyed the room, assessing his team. "Lieutenant Morales," he said calmly, "you have the medical emergency. Coordinate triage and stabilization. Report back immediately with progress." "Yes, sir," Morales replied, visibly reassured by the clear, calm instructions. "Sergeant Hill," Briggs continued, "oversee the logistics breakdown. Empower your team to find solutions. Keep communication channels open. I want updates every 10 minutes." The team moved with precision, responding efficiently to his guidance rather than fear. For the first time, Briggs felt the subtle thrill of seeing true leadership in action, the kind that didn't rely on ego or intimidation, but on clarity, trust, and accountability. Then the most challenging test arrived, the simulated security breach. The screens displayed figures moving into restricted areas, alarms blaring, officers scrambling. Briggs felt panic rise. This scenario could unravel everything he had worked to achieve. He paused. He could have taken control by issuing commands, intimidating subordinates into action. But he remembered the Brigadier General's words. Leadership was about empowering others, not asserting dominance. He addressed the team. "Platoon leaders, assess the threat immediately. Secure all civilians first. Coordinate with security teams to contain intruders. I'm here to support your decisions, not override them. Communicate updates continuously." The room responded with coordinated efficiency. Officers made decisions, soldiers executed orders, and every action reflected trust in each other's capabilities. Briggs watched, heart pounding, as the crisis was resolved without his direct interference, proof that leadership was not about being feared, but about fostering competence and confidence. Hours passed in a relentless series of trials, each designed to strip away the remnants of arrogance, to expose flaws, and to reward accountability. Every decision, every choice, every word was under observation. And yet, for the first time, Briggs felt a strange sense of liberation. The crushing weight of ego had lifted, replaced by the clarity of purpose that came from guiding others with respect. Finally, the Brigadier General stepped forward. The room fell silent, every officer and soldier waiting for her judgment. Briggs's chest tightened, anticipation and fear mingling in equal measure. "Colonel Briggs," she said, her voice calm but resonant, "you have faced the most intense scrutiny of your career. You have been observed, evaluated, and tested in scenarios designed to expose weaknesses and challenge assumptions. Today, you have demonstrated significant growth." Briggs exhaled slowly, relief and disbelief washing over him. "Significant growth?" he asked, voice raw from the trials. "Yes," she said, nodding. "You have learned to delegate effectively, to communicate clearly, to empower your subordinates, and to make decisions without relying on fear. You have shown humility, accountability, and composure under pressure. These are the hallmarks of true leadership." Briggs felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, emotion he had long suppressed, rarely allowed to surface. For decades, he had measured himself by rank, authority, and control. And now he understood the truth. Leadership was not a crown to wield. It was a responsibility to bear, a service to those who follow, and a reflection of one's character. The brigadier general's gaze softened ever so slightly, but the authority in her voice remained absolute. You are not yet a perfect leader. No one is. But you have taken the first, crucial step, recognizing your limitations and learning from them. From this point forward, your actions will determine the rest of your career and the trust you inspire in those around you. Briggs nodded slowly, swallowing hard. Thank you, he whispered, voice choked with emotion. I understand now. The room seemed to shift subtly, the weight of tension lifting. Officers and soldiers exchanged glances, sensing the transformation. The whispers that had once haunted him now carried a different tone: curiosity, cautious respect, and a glimmer of admiration. The brigadier general turned to the assembled team. Let this be a reminder to all. Leadership is not a measure of fear or dominance. It is measured in accountability, respect, and the courage to confront one's own flaws. Briggs walked out of the leadership rehabilitation program for the final time, head held high, yet humbled, transformed, and aware of the immense responsibility he now carried. Soldiers and officers lined the corridors, their eyes on him, no longer filled with fear but with expectation. He had learned the hardest lesson of all: authority without character is meaningless. And somewhere deep inside, he felt a sense of resolve he had never known. He would rebuild, he would lead differently, and he would ensure that every soldier who followed him did so with respect, trust, and confidence, not fear. As the sun set over Fort Ralston, casting golden light across the base, Briggs paused at the edge of the parade ground. The brigadier general approached, her presence as calm and commanding as ever. Colonel Briggs, she said softly, your journey is far from over. But today you have earned the chance to lead again, not as a tyrant but as a true commander. Briggs looked out over the base, feeling the weight of years past, the humility of lessons learned, and the hope for a future built on respect, accountability, and genuine leadership. He exhaled, feeling both the burden and the privilege of command, finally understanding what it truly meant to lead. And somewhere in the quiet corners of Fort Ralston, soldiers whispered, not of fear, but of a leader reborn, humbled, and ready to guide them with integrity. The colonel had fallen, yes, but he had risen stronger, wiser, and forever changed. End of Part 8.